Tonight, the crippling weakness of the Albanese government, now even funding terrorists in two ways. Plus, the Reserve Bank says, sorry, no interest rate cuts likely for Christmas. But the Treasurer once again blames the rest of the world, not himself.
There is a big international element.
Really? Plus, the latest Brittany Higgins court case raises new questions about why Labor paid her more than $2 million of your money. And yet another day of riots in Britain, this time by Muslim vigilantes and others even attacking journalists. Also tonight, Meghan Markle is back playing the victim card again. Or is it a warning to the King? But first, the Albanese government's Middle Eastern policies have become a disgrace. And I just don't mean, how it won't properly call out Islamist hate preachers or won't lead in fighting Jew hatred. It's got worse. New evidence now that its aid has actually been funding Hamas terrorists, new evidence that it slandered Israel by not disclosing key facts about its accidental killing of an Australian aid worker, and new evidence today that it's going soft in Iran. Incredible. Let me show you. First, funding terrorists. UNRWA, which is the United Nations body that looks after so-called Palestinian refugees for 70 years plus, has just admitted it's had at least 9 staff in Gaza that evidence suggests may have taken part in the slaughter of 1,200 Israelis on October 7 and the kidnappings, like this man in black filmed outside a kibbutz moving a body. UNRWA has fired them, but doesn't actually know where they are.
The evidence obtained by OIOS indicated that the UNRWA staff members may have been involved in the armed attacks of the 7th of October 2023. The employment of these individuals will be terminated.
Are any of them in Israeli custody? Where are they? Were they arrested?
I don't have a case by case amount of information. I believe that they're not. I believe that they're not people who are currently in custody.
There are another 9 staff, UNRWA says, are accused, but it can't find enough evidence to sack them too. Like it, couldn't find the evidence that Hamas terrorists had actually hidden tunnels and weapons under and in some of its buildings in Gaza. And all this matters because the Albanese government was warned that UNRWA was hiring Hamas members, many more than these 9. But last year, Foreign Minister Penny Wong decided to double Australia's funding to UNRWA to $20 million. She paused it in March when UNRWA was first accused of hiring Hamas members, but then resumed it, saying, no worries, UNRWA is now going to investigate. And now, yes, indeed, some of our money was going to hire terrorists. He's the opposition leader today.
And we've called for them before not to provide this funding through this organisation, but they've chosen to go with their own bad judgment.
But the Prime Minister today acted like everything was going to plan.
It is a good thing that the United Nations have taken this action.
But Albanese is actually ignoring there's another way that some of our taxpayer money to UNRWA seems to have been directly siphoned off to Hamas to kill Jews. There's a new law case in the United States that says that UNRWA pays its staff in Gaza in US dollars, which is true. But to spend it, those staff have to change those dollars into shekels at money changers, most run by Hamas or otherwise taxed by them, taking allegedly between 10 to 25%. Hamas terrorists taking a percentage of wages paid in part by our donations, by this evidence. Now, to make it worse, this Albanese government's meanwhile thinking of new ways to perhaps permanently settle Palestinians it took in, supposedly temporarily, as refugees, even though these are Palestinians brought in without the government being able to do sufficient background checks. We don't have officials on the ground in Gaza to check for any links to Hamas, even if Hamas would confess, as if. Now, to the second sign of this shameful shambles. Now, we've covered before Israel's accidental killing in Gaza of aid workers, including Australian Zombie Frankham. Now, we said at the time this seemed a tragic mistake in the fog of war. But Penny Wong treated it as suspicious. She sent former Defence Force Chief Mark Binskin to go grill those Israelis. And this is how Wong on Friday summed up Binskin's findings.
Zombie Frankham and her colleagues from World Central Kitchen were killed in an intentional strike by the IDF. It is clear that these deaths were a consequence of a failure of IDF controls, errors in decision-making and misidentification, a failure to comply with senior command direction, and a violation of IDF procedures and rules of engagement.
Sounds terrible, and Wong wanted more investigations, maybe criminal charges. She wasn't satisfied. It's like Israel had no excuse. Except what Wong didn't say was that Binskin's report actually did say it had some excuse. Yes, true, terrible mistakes were made, similar to ones Binskin said other Western militaries had made in the fog of war. But in their defence, Israel had seen gunmen in Frankham's aid convoy and thought they were Hamas or linked to Hamas, hijacking the aid. And what's more, Binskin said the charity had also made mistakes. Wong didn't mention that either. For instance, it didn't follow its own communications protocols. Wong didn't mention any of that. It's like she really wanted Israel to seem as guilty as she could paint it. No wonder the Israeli ambassador has complained. But this government is not just unusually hard on Israel, it's soft on Iran. Iran is the Islamist regime which is actually funding all these terrorist groups attacking Israel, funding Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthi rebels. So that's the third example I now have. Iran's ambassador posted on the weekend that a former leader of Hamas had wanted Israel destroyed. As he put it, wanted the Zionist plague wiped out of the Holy Lands of Palestine by 2027. This is genocidal talk. And the ambassador looked forward, he said, to such a heavenly promise. And this from a murderous terrorist group that's actually banned in Australia. And only today did the Prime Minister publicly call out the ambassador, but he didn't throw him out.
We have called in the Iranian ambassador to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as is the protocol when something like this happens. I'll make it clear, there's no place for the sort of comments that were made online in social media by the Iranian ambassador. They're abhorrent and they're hateful, they are anti-Semitic.
Tough words, weak actions. So that's 3 examples in just the past week of a government that seems driven by contempt for Israel and a fear of offending Muslim voters, particularly in Sydney. Terrorists will cheer, Jews will fear, and the rest of us must wonder if this is a government that can be trusted with our security. Joining me is Michael Shoebridge, a former senior defence official and founder and director of Strategic Analysis Australia. Michael, good to see you again. Listen, comparing what the Binskin report found and what Foreign Minister Penny Wong said about it, what does that tell you about her attitude to Israel?
Well, Andrew, they're like 2 different reports. It's a bit unfortunate that Penny Wong doesn't seem to have read the report. She's stuck with the prejudices she had when she commissioned Mark Binskin to do the report. One of the most striking things in Binskin's report, based on full access to every piece of Israeli information about it, including drone footage of the strikes, it isn't that the Israelis admitted they made a tragic mistake. They did do that. It's that they so rapidly held commanders to account. And so we had Mark Binskin, a former chief of defence here, telling us the Israelis acted to hold leaders to account in 72 hours of the strike, when in the case of our personnel in Afghanistan, no senior commander has been held to any kind of account 12 years on.
Honestly, it's just extraordinary, isn't it? You know, and then on the other hand, you wonder whether Penny Wong is tough enough on Iran. Very tough on Israel, you know, not disclosing key facts, giving it some sort of excuse. But on Iran, that's actually funding the terrorist groups which started this war by attacking Israel. Here's the Foreign Minister today reacting under questioning to that tweet I mentioned from Iran's ambassador here, calling for Israel to be wiped out by 2027.
Those comments are inflammatory and they are repugnant and they do not represent Australia. They are inconsistent with Australia's values and our views. yes, we have. My department has spoken with the ambassador about these issues and other issues.
Now, Michael Shoebridge, is that adequate? Some tough words there, but just sending some unknown official to talk to the Iranian ambassador instead of dragging him in to, face him personally and not throwing him out. I mean, this is a guy effectively supporting a terrorist outfit banned here, and we're supposed to deal with him as an ambassador?
Well, let's remember, the Iranian ambassador called Israelis a Zionist plague, so not even acknowledging that they're humans. Doesn't get much worse than that. This attitude from the Albanese government of, well, when there's a problem we don't want to face, we send officials to do our dirty work, that's exactly the same playbook we see with the Albanese government engaging with the Chinese Communist Party. They don't call the ambassador in. They send an underling or they make a phone call. And it really is a shameful way for our ministers to behave. Why doesn't Penny Wong have the authority to call the Iranian ambassador directly? It's mystifying.
Well, why doesn't she make him walk the walk of shame to her office, or even to her, if she's overseas, to an assistant minister's office, so everyone, and then alert the photographers so they can shame this racist. Meanwhile, UNRWA, this United Nations organisation looking after so-called Palestinian refugees, like it has for more than 75 years, has now admitted that 9 of its 13,000 employees in Gaza, which doesn't sound a lot, may have taken part in the October 7 massacre of 1,200 Israelis, the rapes, the kidnappings, etc. They've been fired. Should the Albanese government be funding this massive bureaucracy, which has likely employed terrorists and terrorist sympathisers way beyond these 9 that we've been talking about?
No. Look, maybe other people have forgotten, but I remember when these allegations were made about UNRWA having Hamas attackers in its organisation, the government said that this was a serious problem, but then they rapidly accepted an initial report that said everything was fine and restored funding. So it seems to me that the current government is very quick to move away from criticism of even the most repugnant terrorist organisations, but is equally quick to condemn our partners and friends, like the Israelis. And that, to me, is the opposite of the right policy instinct. And we should expect better things from the government that we have.
No kidding, Sherlock. Michael Shoebridge, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much. Unbelievable stuff, really. Well, some good, bad news today. The Reserve Bank decided not to increase interest rates, but it wasn't because inflation is not a problem. It's because the economy is so weak, as you may well know. But Treasurer Jim Chalmers was taking all this as a win.
This is a welcome decision from the Reserve Bank because it recognises the pressures that people are under, the progress we've made on underlying inflation, but also the severe market volatility we've seen and global economic uncertainty more broadly.
Now, the Treasurer is taking it as a win because, as always, a weak economy, that's something he essentially blames on the rest of the world, as if the rest of the world only became a factor and a bad one when the Albanese government got elected, as if the previous Morrison government didn't have, say, the COVID pandemic, the China virus to deal with.
The market volatility that we've seen has been driven by weaker than expected jobs growth and tech earnings in the US, as well as rising Japanese interest rates impacting Asian markets as well. That the Chinese economy has been a bit weaker of late, and that has consequences for us as well.
And he went on to blame Ukraine and Russia, etc., as well. The whole world's against him. But the Reserve Bank governor said higher inflation is going to be around for longer than predicted, eating at your savings, eating at your take-home income. Interest rates are not coming down, she said, before Christmas at least.
The fact is that the progress on bringing inflation down has been very slow for a year now. What we can say is that a near-term reduction in the cash rate doesn't align with the board's current thinking.